Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to today's session. You're tuning in to the American Indian College Fund's LGBTQ webinar series. This webinar is a three-part series that will cover LGBTQ topics specific to higher education, identity, and student support. This is an initiative from the College Fund to increase awareness and advocacy for LGBTQ students, staff, and community in and near tribal colleges. Our second webinar is entitled Gender, Sexuality, and Two-Spirit Identity. At this time, we would love to give a shout out to the TCUs that are participating in this webinar. We're so glad you've joined us and hope that you come away with new understanding. Red Lake Nation College, San Carlos Apache College, Chandeska Chicana Community College, Nebraska Indian Community College, Don Otham Community College, Little Priest Tribal College, Navajo Technical University, Leech Lake Tribal College, Northwest Indian College, Lakota Ray Ojibwe Community College, Turtle Mountain Community College, Nueta Hidatsa Sanish College, Southwestern Indian Polytechnic Institute, and Keweenaw Bay Ojibwe Community College. And we apologize for anyone that we missed along the way, but we're so glad that you are here with us. This webinar will be available to everyone who has registered through their email, along with the resources that we will share at the end. We would love to hear from you, so please ask your questions in the chat box, and we will do our best to answer them towards the end of the webinar. Now, we will introduce ourselves again and share with you a little bit of our backgrounds. So my name is Natalie Youngbull. I am Cheyenne Arapaho, Sioux and Assiniboine from El Reno, Oklahoma. My gender pronouns are she, her, and hers. I serve as the Faculty Development Program Officer at the College Fund and administer all fellowships to TCU faculty working towards master's and doctorate degrees. In my role, I also plan the annual TCU Faculty Research Convening, and I'm the co-editor of the TCU Research Journal.
Hello, I'm Davida Del Mar, and I am Navajo from Flagstaff, Arizona. My gender pronouns are she, her, and hers. I work here at the College Fund as a college admissions coach for high school students with the Native Pathways to College program. The Native LGBTQ community is very diverse, and the topic of identity is an important part of understanding gender and sexuality. The purpose of this webinar intends to provide a basis for understanding how place and background play into conversations around gender and sexuality. We also explore the term two-spirit, and we hope to provide a base for more insight into how we can approach identity development for Native students in the LGBTQ community. For our TCU students, this work is very significant. For instance, here is one perspective from a current TCU student. Manny Ramirez says here, quote, "As tribal college university students, I think it's important for us, especially as college students, coming out for the first time out of our homes into a place where we may be unfamiliar with, and uniting on that spectrum with the idea of what it means to be queer in the 21st century is something that I'm new to and something I really needed to understand," end quote.
We are shifting the ground by highlighting these issues. Current information about the LGBTQ issues and identity are for broader audiences and are not specific to Native communities. By engaging in conversations, then the LGBTQ experience within Native communities begins to emerge, and understanding how we can provide better support for all members of that community. Other facets of identity, like race, age, and culture, intersect with gender and sexuality. Tread lightly when talking about these topics, for perspectives are only true to the person who shares it, just like Manny's perspective may only be true to them. Since tribal colleges are diverse in age and experience, it is important to note that perspectives differ. The subjects surrounding LGBTQ perspectives are ever evolving, so it's important to foster and serve the community in all capacities. To better illustrate the information presented, we will draw from one individual who will be known as RUDY throughout this webinar. They share their perspective on gender and sexuality within their Native community.
Sexual orientation and gender identity are not the same thing. Everybody, including those who are listening to this webinar, has a sexual orientation and gender identity. The way people define it may change over time, and the terminology will change as well. Sexual orientation is how a person identifies their physical and emotional attraction to others. In other words, people may not have been physically intimate with someone of the same sex, but may have the desire to do so. Behavior is how one engages or behaves with intimacy and sex, regardless of how they identify themselves. Identity is how people consider themselves. For instance, lesbian, gay, bisexual, etc. Gender identity refers to how people identify their gender. Do I consider myself as female, male, both, neither? All people have a gender identity. Gender expression is how one presents themselves through their behavior, mannerisms, speech patterns, dress, and hairstyles. Both can be defined on a spectrum. Now we will share Rudy's perspective in relation to sexual orientation and gender identity. Growing up, I was a tomboy in my teenage years. I was assumed to be a lesbian, which I never identified with, the whole time still feeling more in the space of a tomboy. I never felt like that space I existed in was about who I slept with or my sexuality. Though there was definitely judgment about that sexuality, which existed separately from looking more like a boy, gender identity, but not always. For instance, sometimes people would make comments specifically about me being a homosexual, and sometimes people would make comments about me looking like a boy or being a dyke, gender assumptions, which in the context or space was about how I looked, versus just being called a dyke or a fag in the context of I look like a dude and I sleep with women. Personally, I didn't care about the fact that people had any opinions about me sleeping with women or that other queers or lesbians, etc., had issues with me sleeping with men. I have never cared about that, and it doesn't mean that I am bi either. It means that I see and love people who have characteristics that I appreciate or value that can be cis men, women, trans, gender nonconforming, etc.
And now we take some time to discuss the term Two-Spirit. Two-Spirit is quite often unfamiliar and misinterpreted within dominant society and sometimes within our own Native communities. We were in search of the origins of the term, and Davida stumbled upon a Canadian article that stated that the term was coined at the 3rd annual Intertribal Native American First Nations Gay and Lesbian American Conference in 1990 in Winnipeg, Canada. In an article published in 2017 by Parker, Duran, and Walters, the authors provided an in-depth definition and explanation of the term. Quote, Two-Spirit is a contemporary pan-Indian umbrella term for American Indian, Alaska Native LGBTQ, adopted by some in the 1980s, and with which some American Indian, Alaska Native tribes identify, but others view with negative connotations. Other individual Two-Spirit American Indian, Alaska Natives adopt the term as a way to recognize the confluence of culture and sexual orientation. While these identity characteristics can vary by individual and by tribe, it may be possible to measure the ways in which dominant mainstream society views and treats these racial, gender identity, and sexual orientation minorities, end quote. Driscoll, lead author of the book Queer Indigenous Studies, explored how Cherokee LGBTQ participants in his study identified with the term. He stated, I asked participants what terms they use for themselves to describe their gender sexualities, and not surprisingly, the answers point to the complexity and slipperiness of identity labels. While Two-Spirit is certainly used often as an umbrella term in contemporary Native Two-Spirit GLBTQ communities, Participants in this research have complex and conflicting relationships with the term, end quote. Participants in Driscoll's study shared that the two-spirit term is understood within Native contexts, but not outside Native communities. This is where the misinterpretation and misrepresentation of the term comes into play with non-Natives. The Canadian article I mentioned just earlier was correct on a few facts, such as two-spirit being an umbrella term, but misrepresented the complexity of its meaning. However, the article stated that two-spirit is an interlinking of gender, sexuality, spirituality, and social roles. We build upon this statement by asserting that those who identify as two-spirit should be understood as having their own connections to that identity. In the final chapter of the Queer Indigenous Studies book, Driscoll and others clarified two-spirit as an identity label. Quote, while individuals may choose the term two-spirit and reject the term gay, or choose the term queer and reject the term two-spirit, there is no reason to see any of these identities as an opposition, end quote. Now we will share RUDY's perspective on how they operate within their Native community. I did and do, however, have a lot of emotions around the fact that due to my gender, I cannot exist and participate in a lot of traditional spaces due to gender roles. There is not enough visibility or dialogue in our community to allow people who might exist in different spaces along the gender spectrum into those spaces which they might not normally be permitted. For example, women are not supposed to help build sweat lodge fires, and we are supposed to wear skirts when we do certain things, in fact, most things. We are not supposed to take care of the fire in ceremonies, and of course, traditionally, we did not participate in Sundance ceremonies. So there are a lot of assumptions about who I am, and that I should only participate in certain ways in traditional spaces, as well as in other spaces. I personally feel comfortable, confident, and beyond that, like I belong in those other spaces. I am comfortable in both pants and skirts in certain contexts and at certain times. I feel as if I can move between those spaces, but not always. Like sometimes I don't feel like it's appropriate to wear pants and I am comfortable in a skirt and vice versa. There are also a lot of assumptions made about being a young woman and being helpful to men who hold certain spiritual positions. And by this I mean that people will make assumptions that all young women being helpful to an older man to which they are not related means they are with them, as opposed to trying to understand anything about my identity.
As Native people, we should consider how we are part of a whole community where it is important that we understand how gender and sexuality can inform how we interrelate to one another. Certain facets of our identity become evident when we are put in social spaces. This quote uncovers one perspective of what it means to be queer and indigenous. Quote, many times coming out means making a choice between being indigenous and remaining a part of our communities without discussing or disclosing our queer and or two-spirit identities, and being queer without a community of other indigenous people and exoticized by non-indigenous queer people, end quote. Sovereignty for Native people is also a place of intersectional ideologies that can be discussed in social, emotional, physical, and cultural context. Robert Warrior looks at intellectual sovereignty, where he states that the struggle for sovereignty is not a struggle to be free from the influence of anything outside ourselves, but a process of asserting the power we possess as communities and individuals to make decisions that affect our lives, end quote. His argument allows for we as Native people to not work within the confines of what is presented to us, but instead be creative in how we form our theories of activism and history. This is what the two-spirit term aims to offer, an alternative to labels in the queer community. At the same time, it's up to the person to understand how they fit on the spectrum and what it means to be queer, as Manny pointed out earlier. In our last webinar, we mentioned that TCUs reflect their community, and it is the responsibility of our tribal nations to serve all people. Start by understanding the traditional and cultural values of the LGBTQ identity. We must reassert and have ownership of how we interact, define, discuss, etc., with LGBTQ plus members of our community. We must become allies to one another in our struggles. Otherwise, LGBTQ students may feel invisible or not important when it comes to their everyday experiences. Creating support groups, events, and social gatherings for and with LGBTQ people will acknowledge and celebrate this group. For it is important to understand what gender and sexuality mean and how they work in our histories, stories, and experiences. Creating events where students and staff can be more informed about LGBTQ issues specific to their location, tribe, and community is so important in garnering support. Finally, we hear from RUDY. There just simply isn't the support or spaces created to talk about these issues. So we, as in queer, LGBTQ, two-spirit, etc., natives, are for the most part invisible, or worse, when you are seen, you are denied, objectified, or even demonized. So even if you ever find love, whether it is self-love or the love of another, you will be told that you do not deserve that love, or that you are wrong for having it how you do. I would say this is the same for Native women in a lot of communities in regards to being objectified and invisible. All of this obviously has a tie to colonialist language and ways of thinking colonizers, in which once you house people in spaces that deem them inferior, you can treat them inhumanely because they are no longer human. And for whatever reason, a lot of our Native communities have yet to revisit this horrible way of thinking and being towards our beautiful LGBTQ2 relatives.
So that's it for us. Thank you so much for attending. Here are the two main resources that we used and quoted from during this webinar. Also, here's a list of resources that can be helpful in understanding the topics or events we have covered. We offer these resources in hopes to spark some understanding around these important issues. And finally, our next webinar is scheduled for Wednesday, May 9th, 2018, at the same time, 12 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time, and is entitled Student Reflections from LGBTQ Events at Tribal Colleges and Universities. This webinar will give the recipients of the ARCIS grant the opportunity to share their experiences of starting their own programs and what it means for future outreach. You can start registering for the webinar today if you'd like. Again, thank you for joining us. Many thanks to Manny Ramirez and RUDY for sharing their insight about today's topic. Also, thank you to the outpouring of support from the TCUs. And now we have some time to answer your questions and invite you to share any resources that could be helpful to all present on this webinar.
So the first question was to request the webinar be available, and if you had to leave early, and yes, it will be available. So if you've registered for this event, you will get a copy of the full recording of this webinar, as well as we hope to actually post the video of this webinar in the future on the College Fund website. So that will be collegefund.org. And in addition to that, of course, we will send that communication via social media, email, so that can be communicated more directly to you.
We have another question coming to us from our lovely assistant. Is there an archive of the previous webinar? Yes, there is. And like Davida said, we have yet to post it just because we are working on getting it up on our website, hopefully soon. But I think that if you had registered for the previous webinar, then you should have received a recording. If you haven't, then please just have some patience with us and we'll get all 3 of the webinars posted as soon as we can. Do we have any other questions coming through? If not, then we are so grateful that you were on our call, that you attended the webinar. We hope you came away with some more information and understanding. And we look forward to our 3rd and final webinar for this semester. So we hope you join us then. Oh, we have another question coming through. what we can do right now is we can go back to these resources. If you haven't been able to copy them down, we'll take some time for you to go ahead and screenshot these or write them down.
So the next question is, do you have info on how to start groups for LGBT groups on campus? So there's no like 10 steps to making the, this kind of environment and creating spaces for these intense conversations. But in our resources, we did provide a couple of things. So in order to kind of gauge what kind of resources are around you, the last one is a state-by-state resource list. So of course, we're talking to a lot of TCUs that are across the country, and of course, each community is different. So if you wanted to reach out to resources that are already present within your state, I highly suggest that. So that's a state-by-state resource at the very end. There's also the resource above that is a network of gay straight alliance clubs, and they actually give you resources for people who want to facilitate discussions as well as start groups, and how that works and what it means to kind of address these topics, especially if you have a passion for it but don't have a lot of understanding around it. And I think the webinar that this webinar kind of communicates that it's, just open a conversation. I mean, really create that space of like, well, this is what it means to be this, or and do it in a respectful way. I think that's what our main goal here is, to have these conversations in a sense where you feel community, you feel supported, and yes, good luck to you, because this is definitely what's needed. And actually, just to mention real quick, we actually had an event at AHEC called Reclaiming Family. And the feedback we got from the participants at that event was that there's not a lot of resources on campus. So I think if there's efforts around to garner support around leadership, faculty and staff and students, I think you'll have a lot of support there unknowingly. But the point of that, what we found with Reclaiming Family, is that there's not a lot of support. So please start those.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Davina. So we have another question that about the list of resources and if it can be emailed out. Yes, we can definitely get the list of resources emailed out to you all. And I don't think we have any other questions at this time. So again, we thank you for your time. Thank you for being on the call with us. We hope you have a wonderful day.
Yes, and one last time, that's our contact information. So feel free to email us directly, both of us as well. And of course, you can call our main line and ask for us directly as well. So we are open and here if you would like to communicate.
All right, have a good day.